off of the presentation that I gave at the Nevada Water Resources Association conference in February. But it's been a couple of months. We have some more data to present and just some more depth of the insights that we shared, and I've structured it a little bit differently. So I'm part of a broader project here at the University of Nevada, Reno called Where We Live. The project overall is examining how rural communities perceive and are adapting to environmental hazards. And we're focusing specifically on three hazards: drought, heat, and wildfire. So it's myself and Dr. Elizabeth Cobley in the Department of Political Science. We also have colleagues in economics and extension. That's Dr. Adam and Dr. Singletary. And then our colleagues at the Desert Research Institute, Christine Albano and B. Gordon. And this is an NSF-funded program. It's an EPSCoR grant, which is to stimulate research. And so it's in three EPSCoR jurisdictions, including the University of Idaho. So there's research in Idaho, South Carolina, and in Nevada. And I've gotten questions about this because especially South Carolina seems a bit random. But all of these states were selected because they each are typical of one of these hazards. So, fire, Idaho leads the nation in fire impact. South Carolina experiences extreme heat, and then Nevada is emblematic of the drought challenges facing the Western United States. So across these sites, we're hoping to understand factors that contribute to local adaptation to environmental hazards with the goal of discovering how we can enhance community scale responses to adaptation. So we're asking a few research questions across all of these sites, including questions around how people's perceptions of change related to drought, heat, and wildfire compared to recorded instrumented data, scientific measurements that we have on record, and understanding that gap between what people perceive and what's been measured. And then we're hoping to use these results to help communities improve how they're adapting. So a lot of our questions that we asked in our survey are common to all of these states, but each of the states is diving in a little bit more depth into their specific hazard. So we chose to work in the Humboldt River Basin rather than working Nevada-wide, and we selected the Humboldt River Basin because it's wholly contained within the state of Nevada. And we're using two main methods to answer our research questions. We have in-person surveys that are assessing perceptions and adaptation actions, and we have key informant interviews that we did throughout the basin to get more in-depth qualitative insights. And when we selected this Humboldt River Basin case study area, I say we, but this was before I had started on the project back when, probably 4 or 5 years ago, they started the conversations around what the study areas would be. We selected the Humboldt River Basin because it's within Nevada, because of the challenges it faces with drought, but we did not know much about the discussions around conjunctive management. And I imagine most people on this call have some familiarity with what's going on in the Humboldt, but just as a quick high-level overview, the Humboldt's very typical of a lot of river basins around the Western United States that are struggling with drought, that the senior water rights under the system of prior appropriation, the people who hold the most senior rights, are at the bottom of the river. And so over the past handful of years, the senior water rights have not received their full allocation at the bottom of the river. Typically, the state engineer would use curtailment to curtail junior users in order to make those senior water rights holders receive their whole allotment. But it's been complicated in the Humboldt because of the implications and impacts of groundwater pumping, which really accelerated starting in the 1960s. So that's required conversations around conjunctive management, which is the joint management of surface and groundwater. And so we've expanded our methods and the questions that we're asking in order to ask about conjunctive management, as well as the questions that all of these states are asking around perceptions and adaptation, because conjunctive management is such a huge piece of the adaptation puzzle in the Humboldt River Basin. So this is the same map that I showed in Las Vegas, but it's updated with the total number of surveys. So we've wrapped up at this point. We still had a few ongoing sampling efforts, but at this point, we've wrapped everything up. We have a total of 640 surveys that we completed in person and a few online throughout the basin. And I've blown up the legend so that it's more visible on PowerPoint, so it's not to scale, but you can see based on the size of these dots that we have a really great spread throughout the basin. We did a stratified sampling approach based on the size of the river basins, and you can see the number of responses based on upper, middle, and lower basin. We also conducted in total 36 key informant interviews. We started these in September of 2025 and finished up last month. This was according to a questionnaire that was approved at the university. It involved three key themes. One was around perceptions of environmental change, one was around adaptation to change, and then the third was around conjunctive management. I have on the right here the number of interviews by sector. We tried to get a representative number of interviews based on the proportion of water rights held by these different groups, but we also wanted to make sure to hear voices who might not hold water rights but might otherwise be interested in the fate of the Humboldt River and also interested in hearing the perspective of federal and state agencies. So I wanted to start by sharing some of those results from the surveys, and this has been put into a manuscript for peer-reviewed publication. We're in the final stages of preparing to submit to the journal. And this is about how residents perceive changes related to drought, heat, and wildfire. So for our survey methods, we assessed perceptions across 4 dimensions. Those 4 dimensions are severity, so how severe, say, droughts have been, frequency, if it's dry more or less often, timing, whether it gets hotter or earlier in the season or later in the season, and duration, how long these events last. So the questions that we asked were worded to capture respondents' lived experiences and recollections of conditions since they've been living and working in the area. And we asked them at the beginning of the survey how long they've been living or working in the area. And we used a Likert scale, and I have a picture here on the bottom of what one of these survey questions looked like. So it's a 7-point scale where people are able to say about the same, just smack dab in the middle, but indicate extremes. So much wetter on one side, much drier on the other, and they can indicate degree and severity. So walking through these in order of drought, heat, and wildfire. First is drought. We have distribution of precipitation perception variables. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I wanted to highlight for each of these the overall question that we asked. So for this, we asked overall, has it gotten wetter or drier? And you can see that's in the upper left-hand corner. The most frequently selected response was right in the middle, but the majority of people who responded did perceive that it's getting drier overall. In total, it was 61% of respondents perceive that it's getting drier, and only 16% of respondents thought that it's getting wetter. The same trend holds true when it comes to temperature. So on the bottom right-hand corner, we have this overall question of has temperature gotten hotter or cooler overall? Only 10% of people perceived that it has been getting cooler at all. The most frequently selected was that same right smack dab in the middle, but 50%, the majority of respondents, did perceive hotter trends, that it's been getting warmer in the region. The final is fire, and the question about whether fire has overall become more or less common. We see the same trend. The most people perceive smack dab in the middle, no change, but 50% perceive that fire is getting more common, with about 16% thinking that it's been less common. So when we looked across all of the surveys and the results in our analysis, what we noticed is that residents do perceive intensification of drought, heat, and wildfire in severity, frequency, and duration, and the impacts of drought and prolonged heat. So drought and heat were the most salient to the Humboldt River Basin. So the dominant narrative that emerges from those findings is that it's been getting hotter, drier, and hazards have been lasting longer. But shifts in timing have received the weaker consensus of those 4 different dimensions that we looked across. And what we hypothesized is that these perceptions likely reflect the community's direct dependence on mountain snowpack and snowmelt for water resources. So we also have the interview findings from the water users across the basin, and this allowed us to ask questions more specifically and get into a little bit more nuance of why people perceive what they do and what those perceptions mean. Rather than checking a box, people were able to elaborate. And so these questions about perceptions were often worded a bit more open-ended, asking how people have been perceiving changes related to water. So the things that they talked about were the aspects that were most important to them to answer our questions rather than predetermined by the survey. And what we noticed was a differentiation in the different parts of the basin in terms of what's driving these narratives. So, in the upper basin, what we heard a lot about was changes in snowpacks, warmer winter, and springs. So these are three different quotes that sort of get at this. The top one here from one of the agricultural users, where I've noticed the biggest changes in warmer winters and springs, you see more rain instead of snow in the fall. Someone elaborated, and this was typical from the upper and middle basin, and all of the respondents, a lot of them did have long histories of living in these basins. So this person said, our last great snowpack winter was 96, and I was always told as a kid that that winter was basically a little bit more than normal winter on average. It seems like we've never really gotten a good winter ever again. We've seen considerably less snowpack altogether, and this area has lately has had earlier springs or earlier melt off in the last probably 6 or 8 years. The quote on the bottom also introduces this idea of the cyclical nature of what people are experiencing. So this interviewee said it depends on your snow impact for the summer. You know, winter, that's basically all the water we're going to get. It's the snow coming off the mountains. The same narrative held true in the Middle Basin. People emphasized changes in snowpacks, warmer winters, and springs. Someone mentioned as a kid growing up, you could bank on a decent winter all the time, it seemed like. And then, I don't know, the late 90s. And from there, the late 90s on, it seems like it's just a roller coaster. The person in the middle, our fourth interviewee, said from a hydrological standpoint, the way the weather has shifted, they're getting more spring rain activity, which brings our snowpack down a bit more quickly. And so we're having to change the way we operate. And then the last interviewee on the slide here, the third interview that we had was that on big snowpack years, there's lots of water and then there's not. In the Humboldt River Basin, it seems like it's either all or nothing. So there was a lot of agreement in the upper and middle basin, but what was very vastly different was the users in the lower basin, who talked more about the impacts of pumping, the amount of water in stream, and the amount of water that they are receiving through the irrigation district. So the first interviewee that we talked to on the agricultural side of things, when asked about changes in water, said the change is how much is getting here. They used the example just a year ago in April, we had a snowpack of 125% of normal, okay? We got 1/3 of our water down here in the river, 1/3 of our allocation. And all of the different water users were talking in terms of allocation and in terms of acre feet. So this one in the middle, in the last 10 years, it's been considerably more drastic to where we'll have 2 or 3 good years with 3 acre feet, and then we might have a year or two, and it might be 2 years where we've actually been issued zero water. And then the final, when I was a kid, a short water year was probably 1.75 feet, 2 foot allocation. Full allocation for us is 3 feet in Lovelock. The whole time I was growing up, I never remembered a drought. I think the first real one was in 91, and then it just started to get worse and worse. So we have this data on perceptions, but what's important to us as researchers and especially in the context of conjunctive management is asking the question of why these perceptions matter to decision making. And we ask this specifically around conjunctive management because that's the decision making that's so pressing. So we had two key research questions guiding this analysis that we did. First, we wanted to understand why managers say that stakeholder perspectives are important. And second, how managers use stakeholder perspectives in decision making and the barriers that they face in doing so. So our findings, when we looked across all of the interviews, we analyzed 16 interviews with people who had a basin-wide perspective. We had 3 key emerging themes, and I'll walk through these on the next slide, but these related to both why engagement matters and how stakeholder perspectives are used. And these are around defining the problem, the legal challenges that people face, and questions of legitimacy. So first, around the problem definition. Stakeholder perceptions are understood to be important to work towards a shared problem definition because these understandings that users hold shape whether and how stakeholders think the problem should be addressed. We had a great quote about this where someone said, for many water users, drought doesn't always come to mind. A lot of times, a user will blame mining or agriculture for overpumping or overallocation of water. And all of those things contribute, and not one thing's the factor, but we like to point fingers because we think we can course correct once we point a finger. So, recognizing that it's important to understand how stakeholders perceive the problem, the Division of Water Resources has done a lot around stakeholder engagement to identify possible solutions. They hosted for several years listening sessions throughout the basin and initiated that stakeholder working group within the Humboldt to bring users' ideas for solutions to the table. We heard a lot from different users, both within and outside of these processes, about those listening sessions and how those led into the stakeholder working group. The second big area where stakeholder perceptions are important is around legal challenges, because within Nevada, the state engineer and any regulatory agency is constrained by Nevada water law. The state engineer is curtailment. And that's a fairly blunt tool that can have fairly blunt impacts on livelihoods. So, what we heard a lot about in these interviews was that stakeholder perceptions inform how the state exercises its authority and enforces water law. The top quote here gets at that point. It says, there are going to be winners and losers. It's that simple. We have a regulatory mechanism, and we really need to be trying to minimize the impacts and, to the extent possible, avoid having people go bankrupt, lose their livelihoods, and have communities start to decline. So, recognizing that curtailment can have these negative impacts, stakeholder perceptions are used and can be used to spur actions that lie outside of what's currently available to the states in their authority and in Nevada water law. And the bottom quote gets at that point that anyone who wants it to be truly from those affected to come up with the solutions, we've got to provide them with the actual legal framework to do that. So these conversations were more about the legal changes that might be able to happen to support this policy change. The final aspect was around legitimacy. A lot of our interviewees talked about stakeholder perceptions as being important to help managers and decision makers understand what water users consider legitimate. Oftentimes, people would discuss how anything that's decided is going to end up in court. So, understanding stakeholder perceptions on the front end can help to minimize how long something's in court or how severely something is fought in court. So this top quote gets at that. As we move toward a conjunctive management approach, I think many of the water right owners that are relying on groundwater think, you guys gave me this water right. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm doing what you told me I could do, and now you're just going to take it away from me. To this end, we also heard about stakeholder engagement being used to address misunderstandings and to build trust and address instances of mistrust. A lot of times, when it comes to decision making around these complex issues, interviewees spoke to how things would get misunderstood and then miscommunicated. And this bottom quote gets at that. Things get misunderstood and communicated in these rural communities, and then it just kind of snowballs, and people get these ideas, and it's just not accurate. And so understanding what stakeholders perceive can help people be a little bit more proactive in addressing those misunderstandings and getting people on the same page. So when we look across all of these different types of data, what does it mean for both policy and practice and for the Humboldt River Basin moving forward, but also for areas outside of the Humboldt River Basin? One key finding is that user perspectives really do shape the pathways forward for conjunctive management in terms of what's feasible and what's desired. And these understandings of conjunctive management, and this is more of some preliminary examples that I've pulled from our data, but we haven't completed this analysis. Just as perceptions of environmental change vary by geography throughout the basin, so do perceptions of what conjunctive management should and could look like. In the upper basin, we heard multiple people talking about the issues of sending water downstream, with the concern that even sending water downstream wouldn't guarantee anything because it might evaporate before it gets there. A lot of people would talk about the Humboldt as being very serpentine, having a lot of places where it loses water. And so basically saying it's not that simple. This is one quote: on drought years where everything was just horribly dry, they're calling for water. It's ignorant to send water to them because it's all going to evaporate before it even gets there. In the lower basin, we hear that opposite contrast around the need to implement curtailment. This is an example quote from that. He has all the tools, first in time, first in right. If you're affecting someone's water curtailment, now that causes economic impact up there when you could curtail that user. But if you don't do that, we're receiving the economic impact in the lower part of the basin. People in the middle part of the basin emphasized a little bit more nuance of the relationship between groundwater and surface water. So, this is one quote that said, if there is a scientific relationship that can be proven, I think a reasonable person would say, I mean, maybe we should remedy that somehow. We also found that people need to understand how they will be impacted to spur those bottom-up solutions. A lot of our stakeholders who participated in the key informant interviews emphasized that bottom-up solutions could be a solution to these problems that lie outside of prior appropriation and the tool of curtailment, the regulatory tool of curtailment. But in order for something like that to happen, the interviewees we talked to thought that people need to better understand what's going on. This quote at the top uses the term deer in the headlights to refer to how some people respond to conversations around conjunctive management. And we heard that term in multiple interviews of the Nevada Cattlemen's Meeting, where the state engineer spoke towards this concept of conjunctive management. This interviewee said, I think the response from the audience was kind of deer in the headlights and not really understanding why they were trying to pursue this. We also heard from someone who has a basin-wide perspective that a lot of the farmers who are pumping groundwater don't know that they have potentially a bullseye on their back for being the ones causing the conflict. And then, to the same effect, we had this quote from a water user when asked about conjunctive management, just expressing that they didn't really know much about it. This user said, I do think I would like to have more information on the conjunctive use and the thoughts behind it and what that would look like for the region and the area, because it would have a large impact potentially on us. And this was a user, the MA refers to a middle basin agricultural user, which is certainly the area where a lot of the conflict is occurring. Finally, we also heard from both water users and decision makers alike that top-down threats might be needed to spur action. So many of the interviewees believe that meaningful dialogue won't occur until there is a threat of direct impact to these water users. And that should, at the time we were talking about it, a lot of people were looking towards that draft curtailment order as being the threat that would sort of kick people into gear. And we had a lot of quotes that got at the same sentiment. For example, the one at the top, until there's a threat of curtailment, most users have been slow to react and plan. The second is that's when we're going to see the meaningful dialogue start, when the state engineer has to put that on paper, because that's what drives these agricultural guys. The next two are different versions of that same sort of quote. No matter what the data shows, someone's going to fight it. It's going to end up in court for a long time, emphasizing the urgency of the situation. And then someone else saying that these conversations have been happening for forever and something needs to change in order to get people to actually do something. And that quotes, geez, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, my dad was having this conversation. So I wanted to end with just a couple of key takeaways that link to other research, because what we've found in the Humboldt River Basin certainly echoes what others have found in other places, both throughout the West and in different parts of the world. First, around environmental governance, it can be difficult to address emerging challenges because they're not very well understood by different groups. And there's a lot of literature on collaborative governance and stakeholder engagement that emphasizes coming to a shared problem definition as important. So that is something that we found in our interviews that others have found elsewhere. Another important takeaway is that just sharing information with water users isn't necessarily enough. Without longer term engagement, stakeholders are likely to not really understand the information that they've been receiving and remain skeptical of it. And there was a study in Idaho who was led, this study involved some of the colleagues that we're working with on this project, but isn't explicitly related to the collaborations. They found that involving stakeholders in models and helping the stakeholders understand how models work helped to give them confidence to co-produce solutions and work towards solutions together. They emphasize sustained participation, iteration, development of models informed by local knowledge were all very important factors that help to foster co-ownership. And then final two key takeaways are around first, balancing closed door conversations with public engagement. In a lot of natural resource contexts, especially around water, privacy is important to have conversations around options forward that might be politically unpopular or might feel risky to even suggest. And in the Humboldt, there has been a lot of criticism of these stakeholder engagement processes for not adhering to open meeting law. And it's important to balance that. It's important to have these groups that are able to talk amongst themselves without having to worry about what their neighbors might think, but also to have a more public forum or transparent process. And the state has made efforts to that regard. They post the meeting minutes from these public meetings, the stakeholder working group meetings online. But there are other ways that might help stakeholders who are not involved in those processes feel a bit more confident or feel like those processes are more legitimate. Examples can be processes to determine group membership. And that's something that we heard in the user interviews was some people understood how the people who are involved in the stakeholder engagement group, how they came to be part of it. Others felt as though those were handpicked and didn't really understand how that process had unfolded. The final key takeaway is around the idea of being ready to do effective outreach. So, research from around the world has suggested that institutions that have organizational capacity in place for these collaborative efforts are the most successful and are able to have these collaborative efforts succeed. An example of that in the Humboldt is around the stakeholder working group. Each of these stakeholders was meant to represent their broader group. So there are people who are meant to be representing agricultural users in the lower basin. But one of the sticking points was that these individual representatives weren't equally communicating with the groups that they were meant to represent. Some people were more vocal than others, and it unfolded a little bit unevenly. So moving forward, thinking about providing a little bit more capacity, a little bit more support for these different stakeholders or for those representatives could help lead to better outcomes. I also wanted to wrap up just the presentation with a little preview of what's next for our research. So we've only done that first cut. We finished data collection in the last couple of months. We'll have a couple more analyses that will be coming out, examining, for example, how perceptions compare to instrumented data. We'll be using mixed methods analysis, so using both surveys and interviews to understand the factors that shape perceptions, including information sources, for example. We'll be exploring factors that shape different adaptation pathways. And then we have other members of our team who will be working together on community engaged workshops focused on adaptation and getting stakeholders engaged in the science side of things. And I have had some questions from people in previous presentations about that first output of how do perceptions compare to instrumented data. And I did snagged this. I snagged this slide from my colleague who's working on this. This is all being led. The survey analysis is being led by Enoch Adam in the Department of Economics. And so this is just a first, very preliminary, and some of the data might change. They're still figuring out what data to use for the middle column here around the measured trends. But you can see some of these factors like overall dryness at the top. The perception alignment is about 70%. So about 70% of people perceive the trend accurately. Similarly, hotness in the summer at the bottom, around 60% are seeing that accurately, and about 40% are misperceiving that change. So I wanted to conclude just by sharing my email address. If anyone has questions or ideas, very happy to field those via email, or happy to chat now as well. And then we do have a project website that should be updated within the next few days with some more details. We're trying to keep that fresh with some of our findings. So that's just wherewelive.org. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing and see if anyone has thoughts or questions. Ooh, Ben, that's a really great question. So, Ben's question, do you think outreach and collaboration needs to be independent from the public agency? Oftentimes, the statement, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, is not well received. This is a tricky one in the Humboldt. What I've been hearing from the water user interviews certainly indicates that I think both things need to happen in tandem. I think it can be very helpful to have trusted third parties or have someone who's sort of impartial to the process involved in the outreach and in the education. And I think that's a huge part. I mean, as someone who's has this aspiring career in universities, I think universities can play a great role in providing information, trying to be a little bit more objective and provide, for example, extension publications. But I think at the same time, developing relationships between these agencies and the water users is very important. I heard from multiple water users about how they didn't necessarily, there's been a lot more high turnover at the state where they don't necessarily even know who to contact, and that they've made a lot of progress in recent years in establishing those relationships and building those with, who to ask when you have a question. And so I think that while it is important for there to be these external parties involved, I do think that a focus on trust and information sharing and trust building, relationship building between these different regulatory agencies and the water users is still a big piece of the puzzle, especially because they are going to have to be interfacing a lot more in light of these increasing environmental hazards.
Any other questions for Gina? Oh, Scott has something.
Hey Gina, that was a fantastic presentation. It's so cool to, see the real life people aspects of water and water management. In your research so far, what advice do you have for me as a water manager, and how can I take some of the lessons that you've learned in your work and put it in my day to day?
Well, that's a tough question. And I think one thing I was just talking informally with someone yesterday. I think a lot of why people like hearing about the qualitative data that we collect is because it does add this human aspect and this human element that is missing in a lot of people's day to day. But I don't necessarily think that people's day to day needs to change because a lot of what people do is providing really essential information and services. And so community outreach doesn't necessarily need to be a part of your job. But I do think that advocating for better communication is very helpful to come from the inside out, from bottom up. I think a lot of the capacity that, or I guess a better way of saying it is a lot of these agencies don't have the capacity to prioritize these things. So having an understanding of why it's important can be really helpful in articulating why relationship building matters and why outreach efforts matter, rather than just saying it's something that we should do because we check a box. And I think a lot of times that box checking is ineffective way for people to use the limited capacity that they have, and spending a little bit more time on engaging and thinking through those engagement efforts could go a long way. So just spreading that sort of awareness. And then I think one thing that we're hoping to do that can help with that is having that data handy and having these publications. We're doing our peer-reviewed publications, of course, but we're hoping to have more public-facing outputs as well that can help people better understand, why it's important to maybe have more conversations or have more of a relationship with water users, and how they can do that. It's a great question. Thanks.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you.
And I'd be curious too. I mean, if you had ideas on why you think or how you think, like what it is that you do and how this could play into that. 'Cause we've talked briefly, but I don't remember the nuts and bolts of, what your day to day looks like and how something like this could play out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, just when I listened to your response, the big things I heard you key on is intentionality and doing it factually based on data. And it's such an important part of that public relation is being intentional and trying to meet people where they're at versus checking that box.
Mhm.
Within like the Truckee system, we like to say that we're open and, whenever anyone has questions, we always try to answer them as best as we can, but answer them in a way that means something to them, not just spew policy. Because
Mhm.
policy is a great way to lose not only interest, but also lose relationships. And in the end of the day, it's the relationships that drive the movement of water, along with gravity, of course,
Yeah.
because water flows downhill. But,
Yeah, it's interesting. The way that I think about it in the research I do is that there was a lot of emphasis on improving the science policy interface for many years, but there's increasingly a broadening scope to science policy and society, especially as more and more human interests are getting involved in the way that we're making our decisions, and there's less to go around, and the problems are getting more complex. And so I think having bringing in that human element, oftentimes organizations are built around that science policy interface when the society is mattering more and more as we're trying to find solutions to some of the complex problems that are emerging and understanding what's feasible and what's actually implementable and what the different management and policy and capacity constraints are. That's kind of where I see this role for social science, which is really fun.
Oh, it's such a cool thing to hear. I mean, from an engineering perspective, I wish we could remove people because it would be a whole lot easier to
Yeah,
solve.
right. Uh,
Here, here.
Gina, I have a question. As part of this project, are you sharing what you learn with your Idaho and was it North Carolina colleagues? Like, do you guys all get together and there's
yeah. We get together a lot. We have a lot of meetings. We have this broken out into different teams. So there's a team working on what those instrumented measures should be.
Mhm.
Those are the people with a lot of the technical modeling expertise, and then people who are working on the perception side of things. There have been a lot of meetings on, how to ask the questions, how to analyze the data. Most recently, we've been talking about how to do the cross-site comparisons and how to compile, aggregate the different data that we've collected. And we're meeting in about a month. We're all going to be meeting in Elko. We have people coming from Idaho and South Carolina, and we'll be sharing sort of what we've learned. And I think the first couple years of these projects often take a lot longer than you expect to get balls rolling and get the interviews done. And so we're really looking forward to that meeting and better understanding how what we've learned in Nevada compares to what other people are experiencing elsewhere. But we don't have that understanding yet. We're really in the early stages of starting to talk across sites. We've been trying to get our own houses figured out first.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Hmm.
And then quickly, I did want to share some things that are going on in the Walker that are related. So in the Walker Basin, like the Humboldt, we have conflicts with surface water and groundwater pumping, and there has been overdraft of the aquifers in the Walker Basin, so groundwater levels are declining. And DWR has put a lot of effort into outreach over the last 5 years, and it's been really fun to watch. They go out once a year. I mean, they're present a lot in the community and try really hard to engage with agricultural producers. And they've been going out once a year and give these presentations where they talk about that interaction of surface water and groundwater. And they talk about groundwater levels and how they've changed over the last year. And then they give producers targets for groundwater pumping for that season. And then they're trying to get farmers to voluntarily not pump some portion of their waters to meet these targets. And it's just been really interesting to watch. I said I appreciate being in a big room with farmers and ranchers who care about science and care about data and want to hold themselves and each other accountable. And, in the early years, you were getting a lot of questions of like, why can't I just pump all this groundwater? Who cares? Like, just pump it. And now, like, no questions like that. And there were a couple new people there this time. And even farmers and ranchers were like, you have misinformation. You need to really take some time to learn the science. And so it's been pretty interesting to watch. I mean, DWR hasn't had to come down hard on them at all. It's still been very much a voluntary effort by farmers and ranchers, but um, it shows how like years and years of talking to them, they're getting it and understanding the issues. So I do appreciate that.
And
Yeah.
Carly, by volunteering not to pump, are they protected from relinquishment of that water right? They're basically
Yes,
protected.
absolutely. Yep.
Because that's always
Yep.
been a problem in most states is there's no incentive to conserve. In fact, there's a disincentive to conserve. So,
Yeah, and DWR has been very clear that they will not take water rights, their groundwater rights away for
sweet.
voluntarily not pumping. So yeah,
Great.
yeah.
That's interesting. It's another big consideration in these stakeholder engagement efforts is who you get coming. So oftentimes the louder voices are the ones who
Right.
want to express their opinion. And I did have a couple of those fringe interviewees who are just this science is all made up and yeah, if you get the wrong people into the room, it can be really counterproductive too for figuring out the best path forward. But that's exciting to hear.
Yeah.
I think
Any other?
I
Oh, go
think
ahead.
one misperception too is people feel like these river models are perfect,
Yeah.
and especially on the Humboldt, you're probably never going to have a model that's, even close to what, 80% accurate, 90%, just because it's such a complicated basin. But you do the best you can and use the model to the best, the best science you've got, and that's about all you can do.
Totally. That's something we've been thinking about and talking about on our team is, as we're moving into this stage of how to help with adaptation actions, it seems like misunderstandings of the model are pretty rampant of, people kind of expected the models to have all the answers. And then there's also just the question of how these processes work. The peer review process that has held up the middle model has really, I think, undermined the confidence in the model. Like, why is it taking so long?
Right.
And as someone who publishes in peer-reviewed journals, it can be totally weird and not have to do. It's just like someone retires and they were supposed to review your paper and they didn't tell the journal. And so I don't know what's going on with the middle model and why it's been held up, but just better communicating how those models work and what you can expect out of them. One of my colleagues was saying that they have the phrase, all models are bad, but some models are useful. And that is certainly a different understanding than the interviewees who are, expecting the model to be good and tell
Right.
them what they need to do and be trustworthy. And so that's a really big sticking point. Um, yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Any other questions for Gina? Well, thanks so much, Gina. It's fascinating, and we really appreciate you taking time to talk to us.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to share and hopeful if anyone has ideas or feedback, you can reach out at any time. So
Well, thank you, everyone. If there's anyone that would ever like to present on one of these committee meetings, that's how Gina got sucked in, was as a viewer and or attending one of these. So please always feel free to reach out. If you need to practice, you have something coming up, we appreciate it, and we love learning from everyone. So keep us in mind.